Okay, music fans, welcome to the launch of a brand new channel where we're going to talk about classic rock bands, classic rock musicians, and make a few of our opinions known, particularly in regard to who is the weakest link in any given band and why. This should be a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to sharing my thoughts as well as hearing your thoughts as we move through this series. First up is the Jimi Hendrix Experience, arguably one of the most important and certainly one of the most influential trios to emerge out of the 1960s, led by the godlike guitarist Jimi Hendrix himself. In regard to this band, since there's only 3 members, you would think that narrowing down who is the weakest link might be an easy task, but in fact it's quite difficult. On the one hand, we can easily eliminate the frontman, the genius, the visionary guitarist who wrote virtually all of the music, all of the lyrics, and rearranged, reinvented, redefined the electric rock guitar as we know it. Clearly, Jimi was not the weakest link in the Jimi Hendrix Experience. This leaves 2 sidemen, Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell. I can already hear many of you saying under your breath, well, of course it's Noel, but in fact there is a bit of a debate to be had. In fact, there's a big debate to be had because despite the fact that Noel Redding is often overlooked, he was a very important part of the Jimi Hendrix Experience's sound. Let's delve a little bit into why this is the case. First of all, as everybody knows, Noel Redding was not a bassist to begin with. He was a guitar player. His audition for the Jimi Hendrix Experience was a bit of a mistake. He thought he was auditioning for The Animals, when in fact Chaz Chandler had him in his sights to play as a sideman for Jimi Hendrix. As soon as Noel and Jimi met, there was an immediate friction between the two of them. Hendrix admired Noel's hairstyle. I'm not sure that he thought much of his playing. Noel, always a very self-centered person, kind of looked at Hendrix as a bit of a novelty. At any rate, Redding did join the band, and the first thing that we can say about his contribution to the sound of the Jimi Hendrix Experience is that he played bass in a very aggressive manner. He was not a tasteful bass player. He was not a particularly inventive bass player. What he had going for him more than anything else was an aggressive, very deeply sexual sound to his playing that pushed Hendrix's guitar just a bit further than it would have gone anyway. I would say that this is Noel Redding's greatest contribution to the band. When you look at something like his songwriting or his background vocals or his general musicianship, he's a subpar contributor. There's no doubt about it. Noel Redding simply had very little to give in the way of creative breakthroughs or visionary flights. If you take a listen to a song like She's So Fine, written by Noel Redding on Axis Bolda's Love, you can see right away that he really isn't a very talented songwriter, and he's an even less talented lyricist. Could be, in fact, that Redding's aggression and attitude was a pre-punk glimpse of the kind of anti-establishment chutzpah that Hendrix probably deeply appreciated. Moving on to Mitch Mitchell, the first thing that we can say about his playing is that he is one of the most busy and active drummers to emerge out of the 1960s next to Keith Moon. The difference between Mitch and Keith Moon is that Mitch Mitchell was a much more controlled player than Keith Moon. Keith Moon, as everybody knows, never practiced and played the drums purely on instinct in a kamikaze cacophony that's startling but also a bit technically jumbled. On the other hand, Mitch Mitchell was a very practiced drummer, coming out of a jazz tradition with a circular style. And what interests me the most about his drumming is his cymbal work, believe it or not. Although he plays a lot of interesting fills and he is a great blues drummer, his cymbal work is something that is graceful, tasteful, thoughtful, creative, and perfectly matches Hendrix's playing, whether they're doing a sensitive ballad or raging into a blues meltdown of intergalactic psychedelia. The reality is that Hendrix never really did a whole lot that Mitch couldn't keep up with, and when they were doing a jam like Voodoo Child, his licks are just as fresh and just as unbelievably new and creative as Jimi's. I think that one reason that Mitch Mitchell is overlooked as a drummer is because he has soft hands compared to drummers like John Bonham and Keith Moon and even Ian Pace from Deep Purple. By contrast, Mitch Mitchell seems to be sensitive and thoughtful, very reflective, as I said, emerging out of that jazz tradition. So that is a brief recap of the musicianship of the two sidemen. What we have in essence is a bass player with an aggressive pre-punk style and a jazz-based drummer who seemed to be deeply inspired by his contact with Jimi. Neither one of the two were very active as far as songwriting or lyric writing or shaping the image of the band. So there's really nothing to consider in that respect when we're looking for the weakest link. It's going to come down purely to musicianship. And in this respect, I think it's quite obvious that Mitch Mitchell holds a very strong edge over Noel Redding, not only in terms of his creativity, but in terms of his technique, his consistency, and his ability to work with Jimi. As everybody knows, Noel made life for Jimi very difficult, asking to be more involved in songwriting basically so that he could get songwriting royalties. He was well known for pursuing some of the same groupies that Jimi was interested in, and he basically saw himself as a star. Interestingly enough, a similar dynamic would take place later in the Band of Gypsies when Jimi asked his old friend Buddy Miles to join the band. And Buddy Miles has a great soulful voice and wonderful, deep, penetrating drumming style, but he had an ego to match. And I think that these really fierce, sort of male-centered personality conflicts between Jimi and Noel are an important part of the early sound of the Jimi Hendrix Experience. But by the time Jimi began to mature and become a more sophisticated player, that friction was no longer helpful. It was in fact a barrier to further progress for the band. So without reservation, I am going to say that Noel Redding was the weakest link of the Jimi Hendrix Experience. In fact, you could consider any number of bass players from Jack Cassidy to Jack Bruce, or even some crazy idea like Paul McCartney. Any bass player with a melodic sense and a sense of adventure could have done what Noel did for the band, and a bass player who had technique and vision could have done much, much more. I leave you with this to ponder. If there had been a bass player in the Jimi Hendrix Experience who rose to the same kind of creative inspiration that Mitch Mitchell did due to his contact with Jimi, what would the results have been? When Jimi left the Jimi Hendrix Experience and formed the Band of Gypsies, the sidemen that he recruited were much less substantive from a creative standpoint, just basically holding down a backbeat, with Buddy Miles providing a taste of soul voice, and Billy Cox, Jimi's old army buddy, just barely able to keep up at all on a basic blues pattern. No matter how you slice it, Jimi was always the star in any band that he was in, and that's natural, the same as it would be for any other musician of his caliber and charisma. In the long run, Noel Redding was not only the weakest link in the Jimi Hendrix Experience, he was an actual barrier to progress. At least that's what I think. What do you think? If you have an opinion on this, on any related issue, please leave a comment down below, and don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. Next week, we'll be taking a look at Aerosmith and deciding who was the weakest link in that band. See you then.